Here we are, cycling back to our very first speaker, Dr. John Pinheiro, who spoke to us in October of 2013 on the Battle of Lepanto. Or every time I listen to that talk, I laugh because he says Lepanto sometimes, and it makes me chuckle. So I've listened to that talk probably a dozen times since that lecture. It's very good. I always listen to it on the feast day on October 7th. It's part of my little personal liturgy of the day. To listen to that and then listen to Steve recite Lepanto, it's a wonderful thing. So I'd like to reintroduce Dr. John Pinheiro tonight for our topic of anti-Catholicism and the American identity. John Pinheiro is the professor of history and the founding director of Catholic Studies at Aquinas College, where he also co-founded the now 5-year-old semester in Rome program. It's been 5 years already. That's incredible. Do you go every year?
No.
Okay.
Every other year.
That's fantastic. Good. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Tennessee. He co-edited volume 12 of the presidential series of the papers of George Washington and is the author of articles on the early American Republic in academic journals, as well as the book Manifest Ambition, James K. Polk, and Civil Military Relations During the Mexican War. His new book, Missionaries of Republicanism, A Religious History of the Mexican-American War, published by Oxford University Press, won the 2015 Father Paul J. Foyk Award from the Texas Catholic Historical Society for the year's best book on the Catholic history of the American Southwest. So congratulations for that. So please applaud one more time as we welcome Dr. John Pinheiro.
No, I don't think so.
He asked me if I wanted to stand for this, but I think that's what this is. So that's fine. Y'all don't say Lepanto in Michigan? Is that true? Well, I want to thank Sacred Heart again for hosting this great event. It's good to be back, and thanks to Catechetical Foundations. It's great to participate once again in what at Aquinas College we consider to be the second best Catholic lecture series in the city. But really, it's great work you're doing here. I'm very happy to be here and follow so closely on the heels of my friend and colleague, Dr. Marshall. And so that's where I'd like to start. I thought about starting with a joke about a Jesuit and a Franciscan and a Dominican. Then I thought some of you probably heard that one, or at least a Jesuit joke at some point. So I'll skip the jokes because I think my remarks are long. So last month, Dr. Marshall spoke about faith in a debauched age, and among the things he said that led to deeper reflection on my part were, quote, if we are marked with the sign of the cross in baptism, we can't not follow the crucified, end quote. This means, Dr. Marshall said, that we strive to know God above all things and thereby know everything in relation to God. And he explored the degree to which modern liberalism, in all its varieties, is a species of nihilism, of indifference to truth, a radically proud inward turn to me and away from God. But he closed by saying, well, it may be that things are not as grim and dark as they seem. But of course, it may be that they are as grim and dark as they seem. So in preparing my comments tonight, which are largely based on the book Mark mentioned, Missionaries of Republicanism, I reflected a great deal on Dr. Marshall's comments, and specifically I gave much thought to the question, why do our times seem worse than ever? I mean, we're not the only generation that thought this, certainly. But why do they? I mean, I've written a history book about the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, but I want to use it tonight in an attempt to answer that question. And the short of it is, I think it seems worse than ever because our perception of the United States has been that it was exceptional, that it was different, that it was free and Christian in the broadest sense of those terms, that it was blessed by divine providence, and that it had indeed, under providence, blessed others with its blood and its intellect and its creativity and its treasure. The Jesuit John Courtney Murray famously argued that in spite of their Enlightenment, liberalism, and heterodox religious views, the American founding fathers built better than they knew. And by this, he meant that they had designed a free nation consonant with a Catholic understanding of natural law, wherein Catholics could comfortably participate in Republican government. And you hear me use the word Republican a lot tonight, and I'm not referring to Donald Trump's current party. I'm just referring to Republican government, meaning a representative form of government prizing civil and religious liberty. That's what we mean here, what I mean by Republican government. That Catholics could comfortably participate in that without sacrificing their faith and without sacrificing their traditions. That actually continued a project started nearly 100 years earlier by Orestes Brownson in the 1860s. So that for over 100 years, Catholics in America had engaged in a serious attempt to formulate an orthodox and a unified understanding of the ways in which Catholicism was suited to republicanism, and as Brownson argued, this was the kind of guy Brownson was, maybe even more complementary to it than Protestantism. Some of that work finally culminated in Dignitatis Humanae, the Declaration of Religious Freedom, promulgated in 1965 at the close of the Second Vatican Council. Some of that thinking on religious freedom. And oh good, I just saw the clock on the back wall. That's helpful, because I don't have one. But what if it's not true that the founders built better than they knew? And you don't want to mistake me, because I think they did a pretty good job. The only thing on my office door is a portrait of George Washington. That's on the outside. Two questions grow from this. That is, what if it's not true that they built better than they knew? And the first question is, what if it's true that Catholicism is ultimately incompatible with liberal Republican government, as its critics have maintained for centuries? Second, even if Catholicism is not incompatible with the notions of freedom inherent to Republican government, to republicanism, what if anti-Catholicism was early on embedded so deep in what it meant to be an American that it could never be uprooted from what it means to be an American? So put a few different ways, could Catholics be good Americans and faithful Catholics at the same time? Nativists have never thought they could be. Anti-Catholic people have never thought that they could be. Having a pope in Rome gave them an allegiance beyond the shores. How could they be fully patriotic? Could Catholics, or I should say, for how long could Catholics live their faith fully and without persecution in a nation founded by Enlightenment liberals who prized individualism and a religious liberty that could mask indifference to truth? The French writer Alexis de Tocqueville thought that they could. That is, that they could live their lives faithfully. As long as the central government of the United States remains small, and as long as intermediary associations like local government and even bingo clubs probably, although I don't think those were around in Tocqueville's time. But all these intermediary associations and local governments, as long as those retained a prominent role in society in what we now just call the federal government, but they used to call the general government or the U.S. government or the central government, as long as that remained small. So what happened to put us where we are today? That was Dr. Marshall's task, and he pointed us all the way back to the slow disintegration of the medieval synthesis and started hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but being an historian, I'm just going to go back a few decades rather than several centuries. So I'm going to go back, I'm going to start in the 1780s with a book by another Frenchman called Letters from an American Farmer by Hector St. John de Crevecoeur. And I'm sure Mark Poston will correct me on that pronunciation later. So Crevecoeur in his book, Letters from an American Farmer, right at the close of the Revolutionary War, in fact, it's pretty much over in 1782, except officially, he posed this question that resonates to the present day, and not just among Catholics, I think. He said, quote, "What then is this American, this new man?" He had a sense that there was something new under the sun in America. And what is it? What is an American? And his answer was this in 1782, "Americans were an agricultural and highly individualistic people. They were fond of their differences with one another, but found in those differences the source of their dynamism and their vitality and their prosperity. They were a people who lived in liberty and they knew how to order their freedom to the good. And it was because they understood the blessings of liberty that they were willing to fight and die and kill for it. That's why they jealously guarded it, because they actually had experience with it. It wasn't an abstract thing. It wasn't a theory to them. Wouldn't liberty be nice? Over 50 years later, Tocqueville said much the same thing in Democracy in America. So too, at the end of the 19th century, did the Wisconsin-born historian Frederick Jackson Turner, though with a decided emphasis on how the frontier experience had Americanized European immigrants and made them self-sufficient and therefore democratic. So what Turner had said pretty much is, you know where political democracy came from? It came from actual democracy. When you're out there on the frontier, it's you and nature, and you might have to depend on a few of your neighbors, but otherwise you're going to be self-sufficient, or you're going to die, or you're going to go back to where you came from. And there's not a lot of options. That's where democracy came from, Turner had said. My students are reading that on Monday. I hope. Well, I should say it's a sign for Monday. I don't want to make any prophecies as Father did when he was up here. The question of American identity I propose to deal with tonight is not so much what an American was or is or could be or should be, because at this point there might be 300 million literally different answers to that. But I want to talk about what most Americans thought they were by the middle 1800s. Because when people think one thing, it doesn't have to be true for it to be operative in their life and drive their decision making. Ideas can have good consequences, they can have bad consequences. That time period saw the solidification of an American identity that lasted long into the 20th century, and that's why I want to pay attention to it. And in getting at the answer, we see just how right the English Catholic historian Christopher Dawson was when he pointed out that religion is the foundation of culture. Man might be a creature of the polis, as Aristotle said, a political animal, but he first gathers in community to worship God, not to govern man. So as I point out in the book, did I mention there's flyers in the back for the book with a little discount? I don't want to forget to mention that. The pivotal, thanks Mark for holding that up. The pivotal event in forming this American identity, an identity that is unintelligible if we don't understand the role anti-Catholicism played in it, was the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. The Mexican-American War was a tremendously consequential war for both countries. The war's immediate cause, you may know the history. If you don't, I'll run through it briefly. The war's immediate cause lay in a dispute over territory claimed by both countries, south of the Nueces River in Texas, but north of the Rio Grande in the newly annexed state of Texas. Mexican and American troops clashed there on April 25th, 1846, and then at the behest of James K. Polk, who had sent American troops into the disputed territory, hoping they would run into the Mexican army, the U.S. Congress quickly declared war on Mexico, as Polk told them, look, American blood has been shed on American soil. There is war. You just have to recognize it. And Lincoln made himself a one-term congressman by calling Polk a liar at the beginning of this very popular war at the time. He challenged Polk. He said, take me down and show me the spot where blood was spilt on the soil, and we'll find out which side of the border it's on, Lincoln had said. I bet Lincoln would say Lepanto and not Lepanto, Mark. In the war, the U.S. Army invaded Mexico by land and sea, taking the capital on September 14th, 1847. Other than a few skirmishes and scattered guerrilla attacks, the fighting war was over. And in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed right near Mexico's most sacred shrine, ending the conflict, Mexico ceded nearly its entire northern frontier, or 1/3 of its territory, to the United States. And that Mexican cession, as it was called, contained Alta California, where I was born, and New Mexico. The latter eventually became the modern states of Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, most of Arizona, and parts of Wyoming and Colorado. So it's a good chunk of land. The title Missionaries of Republicanism comes from a statement by John L. O'Sullivan, the Democratic journalist, who also coined a term I'm sure you're familiar with, manifest destiny. You've heard of manifest destiny before. Well, this was O'Sullivan's other thing. Missionaries of republicanism, what is that? What he said was this: U.S. soldiers going to Mexico would be missionaries. But in this case, not missionaries of the gospel. They would be missionaries of something that I argue most Americans believed could not be separated from the gospel. And that is republicanism, representative government, civil and religious liberty. This gave a transcendent meaning to America, making it exceptional among all nations. And of course, therefore, it gave a potentially transcendent meaning to its wars. And so by the time of the conflict with Mexico, white Americans tended to locate the meaning of America. I mean metaphysical meaning, transcendent meaning. Not the meaning of day to day, but what's the final cause of America, if you will. White Americans tended to locate the meaning of America chronologically in the future. One of O'Sullivan's most famous essays was called The Great Nation of Futurity, which that's got to be a word he invented. I'm not sure. Chronologically in the future, religiously in Protestant Christianity, racially in the whiteness of what they called the Anglo-Saxon, which primarily meant white-skinned people of mostly English ancestry, and geographically in the West. That's where the future was to be had in the West. So what was the origin of this Anglo-Saxonism, this Protestant triumphalism, this equation of Americanness and Protestantness with human flourishing and with liberty? What was the origin of that? The Revolutionary War had largely dampened religious differences in the name of presenting a united front against English tyranny. And so in the 1780s, following the war, Catholics founded their first churches in Boston and in New York. But even so, in the 1780s, between the time of our nation's first constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and its second and current one, limping one, 1789, 7 of the 13 states passed anti-Catholic laws seeking to ensure that only Protestants could hold elective office. In New York, future Federalist John Jay led the effort. When the new Constitution forbade religious tests, most states quickly repealed those laws, and they also moved to disestablish their own state churches. Nobody at the time saw the First Amendment as applying to states, let alone to, what you might say on the street, or if you wanted to put a nativity set in front of an office building or something, but just simply keeping the central government from having a national church. But New York didn't repeal its anti-Catholic laws until the early 1820s. Massachusetts waited until 1833 to disestablish the Congregational Church. And so I look at that period and say, well, it's fair to say that between the 1790s and the 1830s, roughly 40 years, whether they were evangelical Protestants, whether they were Enlightenment deists, most Americans just didn't see the Catholic Church as any kind of immediate or serious threat to the American experiment in self-government. I mean, there just weren't enough Catholics around. Cultural anti-Catholicism remained, but it was unorganized, and it was also nonviolent. That's what started to change slowly at first in the 1820s. And then by the early 1830s, anti-Catholicism really picked up steam, and it didn't let up until the 1850s. And I could take this on up to the present, and I've done that in different lectures for the Fortnight for Freedom and in other places. The campaign in the 1880s, Romanism and Rebellion, Al Smith's fated campaign in the 1920s, the campaign against Kennedy by Southern Baptists, that kind of thing. I mean, so we could trace this forward, but we're going to stick in the very distant past for the most part. So it doesn't let up until the 1850s. There are many factors that help bring about the increased anti-Catholicism among a population who I would describe their anti-Catholicism as largely latent before the Revolution. I mean, it's kind of there. They're from England. The Catholics were the bad guys for a long time in the late 1500s and early 1600s under the reign of Elizabeth and Charles II, and English textbooks were going to reflect that on up to the present day, and same with American textbooks for that matter. But it had largely been latent. But one of the factors that reawakened it is the decade-long evangelical revival, the so-called Second Great Awakening. Another, though, was massive immigration by Irish Catholics and by German Catholics. I don't have the time to discuss them here, but in the book I mentioned a host of other factors, like the Texas Revolution in 1836, a push to then annex the Republic of Texas by Congress in 1844, during which politicians, to oppose Texas annexation, drew on anti-Catholic vocabulary and imagery, and to support it, drew on anti-Catholic imagery and vocabulary, which tells me, at least my argument would be, it's a fairly universal discourse because they're looking for something intelligible to make their argument, a common vocabulary and common categories of thought, and this is where they find it. I'll describe it in a moment here. What else was figured into this? The American response to Pope Gregory XVI's encyclical Morari Vos, and also then to the papacy of Pius IX, which I spent some time on in the book too. This is water. I hope there's a little bit of wine left over after I'm just saying. As Catholic immigration to the United States increased, Americans grappled with how best to preserve their liberties in a more diverse country. I mean, the country grapples with the diversity now and multiple languages. It's not a terribly new thing, but the Protestant denominations present already thought they didn't like each other until the Catholics arrived. I mean, they fought within themselves and outside themselves over infant baptism and liturgy and free will. And if you read the newspapers from the time, the Presbyterians are splitting and fighting amongst themselves. They're also arguing over against the Methodists, and pretty soon, eventually, the big evangelical denomination split over the question of slavery and some aspect of slavery between North and South in the 1840s. Before the country splits politically, it splits religiously. So they're grappling with that, but in the meantime, they recognize that any future prosperity would be tied to the country's seemingly inexorable expansion westward. As Tocqueville pointed out, look, there's no major imperial powers on the continent. There's nothing to stop the expansion. There's nothing to stop then the prosperity if they do this right. Within 2 decades, that popular drive for territorial aggrandizement became known as manifest destiny. What did that mean? Well, what O'Sullivan had said is one of the political parties was blocking the, quote, manifest destiny, the obvious destiny of the country to spread its multiplying millions in Republican government throughout North America. It was the obvious destiny. Now, if you stand in the way of that, this makes you standing in the way of the will of God. Manifest destiny held that American Anglo-Saxons, by providential design, and by reason of their cultural superiority, their religious superiority, and their racial superiority, biology, religion, politics, they're destined to extend themselves in Republican institutions throughout the Western Hemisphere, maybe the world. So on the one hand, evangelical Protestants during the Second Great Awakening were refining a civil religious discourse about America, to talk about American politics and expansion and growth of the country that depended for its intelligibility on anti-Catholicism. And at the same time, nativist political leaders looked at the growing number of immigrants and started adopting Christian symbolism and religious terminology to make their arguments. They used that most directly in the early 1840s during their fight to ensure that the King James Bible be read in the public schools of New York City and of Philadelphia. So the children, have you heard children used to pray in public schools? So in the 1840s, there was a bit of a flap. Which translation of the Lord's Prayer are you going to pray? And which Bible are you going to read? This is one of the things that's going on. And I cover that in the book. It doesn't end well for a number of people in Philadelphia especially. New York, which had Bishop John Hughes, things end a little bit better there for the Catholics because he dares the Protestants to burn down his church, and they don't. But unfortunately, the same thing did not happen in Philadelphia. It was Lyman Beecher, the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe. You're familiar with the Beecher family, very famous religious family in America. Lyman Beecher is probably best known for his temperance work, which is really prohibition work. That is, beginning what took 100 years on the road to prohibition of stamping out what he saw as the evil of alcohol use in the country by people such as catechetical foundations. It was Lyman Beecher, the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who fused these many strands of anti-Catholicism. The traditional, which is out of descending from the English, just kind of didn't trust the Catholics. Did they have more allegiance to the Pope than to their country? The theological, the popular, just the kind of nasty, lurid stories that might be true, might not be true, but you see it in movies today, and you see it on television today. If you watch television, which you shouldn't, but if you do, you'd probably see it. That was very popular then, too. And then the Enlightenment anti-Catholicism, which was more anti-clericalism, and nobody can tell me what to do. It's all about reason. I can figure this stuff out for myself. That gets fused by Beecher with political nativism and evangelical impulses. And in so doing, how does he do that? Well, he appeals to common definitions of liberty and republicanism at a time when most Americans were still figuring this out. You know, what does it mean to be an American? So you have several independent states, nation states really, that decide to create a new central government, and they're really afraid it might get too large, so they don't want to give it too much power. And at what point do they start to identify in some national sense as Americans as opposed to Virginians and New Yorkers? How does that identity grow? Just what are the borders, in other words, of their common identity that they have in common across the country? In the book, I call this fusion, because I couldn't come up with a better term for it, the Beecherite synthesis. It's a synthesis of a lot of different strands of anti-Catholicism. This is what provides the vocabulary and the categories of thought that forms alliances and bridges divides among different types of Americans, the ambivalently religious, but who might be concerned about immigration, the anti-Catholic evangelical Protestants, who aren't so as much concerned with immigration, except for the fact they're mostly Catholic. So if you can't Protestantize them, that could be a problem. But if you can, then as a good evangelical, you're going to try to convert them, right? Purveyors of the white supremacist ideology of Anglo-Saxonism, the nativists, liberal Republicans, they can all talk to each other using Beecher's fusion. Now, here's what he warned in a book called A Plea for the West. He turned anti-Catholic eyes away from Europe and keeping an eye on the Pope all the time and events in Europe, and pointed them to the American West as being the center of what was important for the future of humanity. And he said this. He warned Americans that their mission to lead the world, which had been given to them by God, hinged on, quote, the religious and political destiny of the West. It had to be peopled by Protestants, Beecher said, in order for America to remain Protestant. For Republican government was something only Protestants could sustain. Catholics could move in, they could take advantage of it, but they truly, really couldn't be good Republicans. So what's the main barrier to the God-given mission of America? It's the horde of Catholics immigrating to America. And as Beecher said, guided by their foreign priests who were in league with the Antichrist in Rome, this ignorant rabble threatens to undermine America's Republican foundations. And if you undermine republicanism in America, and it's supposed to spread this around the world, guess what? You've undermined it everywhere. So you're gonna cut the head off at the source. So what's the solution for this? Well, Beecher says we have to build Protestant schools in the West, and then we have to stop sending our sons to Catholic schools. Well, to a group of Bostonian men in 1834, that seemed kind of vague and ineffective a remedy for an existential threat to the nation. So what they did instead is move in on the Ursuline convent in Charlestown, Massachusetts, a school just outside Boston, ushered the nuns out into the night, and burned it to the ground. And this was the first of the anti-Catholic violence in this renewal of anti-Catholicism in America in 1834. In the book, I don't use the designation anti-Catholic to refer to persons who disagree doctrinally with Roman Catholic theology or with ecclesiology or with eschatology. So I would not consider Protestant efforts merely to convert Catholics to a Protestant Christian vision of reality to be anti-Catholic, to deserve that name. So that is, I don't see an anti-Catholic under every rock and behind every post. And everybody who says something nasty about a bishop isn't necessarily anti-Catholic. I mean, but let's find out who the bishop is and what he's been doing or hasn't been doing. So this is how I approach it. Because, of course, Catholics hope to convert Protestants, and that alone wouldn't qualify as anti-Protestantism in the way we would use terms like this. In the best sense, espousal that one's religion is right and another's is wrong is a matter of taking seriously claims about truth. Claims, to paraphrase Aristotle's metaphysics, about what is and about what is not. And that presupposes a conversion of heart and mind, a reorientation toward the truth that is necessary for human flourishing and for salvation. And that's a process that involves argumentation, exegesis, intellect, and not to mention grace. I actually got to mention grace in the book, which is great because it's a secular press. And so that also doesn't fit the definition of anti-Catholicism, at least not that I use in the book. It may fit yours. And if you save me a glass of wine, I'd be glad to argue with you about it after the talk. In the context of the 1830s and 40s, the label anti-Catholic is one I apply to those who maintain that Catholics were not Christians at all, who identified the Pope with the Antichrist of the book of Revelation, who propagated false and hateful stories about Catholics, and I think perhaps most important in the context of American westward expansion and the Mexican-American War, claimed or believed that Jesuits were leading an immigrant Catholic army into the West as part of a papal orchestrated takeover of the United States funded by the Austrians. It sounds kooky, but you have to know Americans are known around the world for their kooky conspiracy theories. This was stuff people believed. The end game of the alleged papal conspiracy was to destroy republicanism at its source. Now, the vast majority of the strident anti-Catholics were the evangelical Protestants, but the most prominent purveyor of the conspiracy besides Beecher was Samuel F.B. Morse, inventor of the telegraph. Here then was the rationale on the part of Americans. So you try to understand the people who hate you. Here's their rationale on the part of Americans who just couldn't conceive of a republic that in any way allowed Catholics to operate freely and in great numbers. If Roman Catholicism was incompatible with republican government, I should have started over here so I could keep going. And if the foundation of republicanism lay in Protestant Christianity, then Americans had a duty to oppose Catholicism and strengthen Protestantism in order to keep their country free. So limiting the freedom of Catholics, especially those most recently arrived from a European monarchy with no experience of self-government, this actually ensured religious freedom. This is what they're thinking. I think this is what they're thinking. And in doing so, it preserves civil liberties as well, because civil liberties are rooted ultimately in religious liberty. So the truth of that paradox seemed as sensible and as uncontroversial as confining criminals to jail in order to protect the community from further crime, as opposed to letting them roam free in the name of human liberty, hoping all the while they morally regenerate on their own. But I don't think that's the main reason so many Americans found the anti-Catholic discourse convincing. The reason for that was by the time they were adults, they possessed an imagination composed of anti-Catholic imagery and stories and vocabulary. Their school books, their grammars, their childhood stories early on prepared them to enjoy what the historian Richard Hofstadter called, quote, the pornography of the Puritan, and more serious sermons as adults. That included most prominently the 1836 best-selling book, The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, a reputed escapee from a convent where horrific things were allegedly done that turned out not to be written by Maria Monk, but by a group of New York ministers. But that was the litmus test. So if the litmus test in the Cold War was, was Alger Hiss guilty? The answer is yes, but that was a litmus test. So, but was he guilty? What's a litmus test for the anti-Catholic? Well, you're not really a strong anti-Catholic if you don't believe in Maria Monk in the 1830s and 1840s. So with little firsthand experience of Catholics, for most Americans, prior to the Mexican-American War, they only encountered Catholics and Catholicism in books, in hearsay, and in tales like this. So in the early 1840s, the production of anti-Catholic literature and newspapers surged because of those fights over the public schools in New York City and in Boston. So let me tell you a little bit about the schools issue. In 1840, New York instituted a strict policy that made only the King James Bible available to students. By 1843, Bishop Hughes had worked on this for 3 years, trying to say, what if our kids read the Douay Rheims version of the Bible? Would that be okay? But finding no other recourse, Bishop Hughes of New York began eventually what became a separate parallel Catholic school system based in the city's parishes. That ideal of parochial education became the norm by the 1880s, which was another period of heightened anti-Catholicism when the American bishops decided every Catholic parish in the United States ought to have its own school. Well, in Philadelphia in 1842, Catholics sought either to excuse their children from Bible reading or to compel the use of an approved Catholic Bible alongside the King James. And the local politicians supported that. It seemed pretty reasonable to them. That's a reasonable way maybe to deal with religious plurality. But the city's evangelical Protestant leaders responded by forming an association called the American Protestant Association, the APA. The APA attacked what it called a conspiracy to destroy religious freedom and, quote, exclude the Bible from public schools. That was the argument they made. So into 1844, we have the year that proved formative in the development of a civil religious discourse in America held together by anti-Catholicism. The anti-Catholic movement was fast becoming politicized and inseparable from rising anti-immigration sentiment. The schools controversy finally seemed to verify Beecher's arguments and to make tales like Maria Monk more believable. Here they are, they're trying to take the Bible out of the schools, the Catholics are. So nativists in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston responded and formed a political party called the Native American Party, which found great success at the polls. The Native Americans were an anti-Catholic political party that preceded the more famous Know-Nothings by over 10 years. So if you've heard of the Know-Nothings of the 1850s, this is their predecessor party. And in 1844, the Native American Party helped instigate a pair of deadly riots in Philadelphia in the wake of the schools controversy. So the people have been stirred up. Catholic homes, schools, and churches were burned in 2 separate deadly riots that year in the spring and summer. Nativists blamed the, quote, vindictive anti-Republican spirit among the alien population, end quote, while Catholics blamed the, quote, concert of evangelical denunciation going on against Catholics in many of the pulpits of the city, end quote. The violence actually horrified most Americans, to their credit, and led to a backlash against the Native Americans, the Native American Party, who still, though, managed to get 6 congressmen elected and to win a number of state house seats, giving them the majority in Pennsylvania and in New York. And later that same year, man I know something about, James K. Polk, somebody has to do it, right? Narrowly won election to the presidency, and Congress debated the annexation of Texas. So it's a big year. Texas joined the Union 3 days before Polk's inauguration in March of 1845, and a little over a year later, the U.S. went to war. So what I argue is that by the time of the war, the Americans are primed to interpret Mexico through the only lens they have, and that's as a Catholic country, and a failed republic at that. One that's economically troubled, politically unstable, but they haven't experienced it yet for themselves. They haven't seen the Cathedral of Puebla. They haven't been to Mexico City. They haven't been to masses. They haven't done any of this stuff till they go into Mexico. This is going to be, for many of them, for many Americans, their first experience of Catholicism outside a couple of the big cities and New Orleans. So let's pause for a second. At this point in its history, what was the United States of America? What was this American, this new man, as Crevecoeur had called him? The most common answer by 1846, the year the war started, that we see it in literature about Mexico, travel books and that sort of thing, in newspapers, among politicians of all the parties. We see it in the pulpit. The answer was the United States was all of those things that Mexico was not. It was free, it was Anglo-Saxon, it was Protestant, it was genuinely Republican, not just in name only, and it was prosperous. racially and religiously different from the largely white Protestant United States, with large swaths of fertile but presumably uncultivated land controlled only tenuously by the government in Mexico City. Mexico served as an obvious target of anti-Catholic sentiment once Americans concluded that they weren't going to stand for burning down Catholic churches in their own country. It also served as the most obvious target of expansionist sentiment once Americans concluded that Indians no longer posed a serious threat to westward settlement. This all was especially true in the wake of the Texas Revolution in 1836, but even more so after U.S. annexation of Texas in 1945. So only 10 years after the Texas Revolution, 1846 then, only 10 years, Americans were drawing on Anglo-Saxonist rhetoric in order to understand Mexico, and they'd begun to see it as the chief obstacle to American greatness. But they also had started to see it as a counterexample to American success, a counterexample to all that was virtuous and sacred in the United States. So some Americans might hesitate to accept nativist claims about U.S. Catholics because maybe they live next door to them. They're more willing to believe similar accusations when made against the non-Anglo-Saxon Catholic Mexicans. In fact, one of the top recruiting tools for volunteer soldiers was the lure of, quote, golden Jesuses. So the way the volunteer army was put together is, I would want to be a captain, so I'm going to put together a company. How do I recruit the company? It's all done democratically. People elected their own officers. State governors appointed the colonels of the regiments, and then the president got to appoint the generals. And Polk was a Democrat, so all his generals were Democrats. We could talk about the alleged water's edge thing in politics at some other day, but never really has been. So how do you recruit? Well, you promise them some loot. I mean, otherwise it's $7 a month in the Army to go to Mexico, and as half the soldiers did, die of the vomito, die of the yellow fever, rather than die in battle. So for $7, maybe not. For all the gold and jewels that you've heard about that are lining the walls of the cathedrals and monasteries and convents of Mexico, maybe so. The religious history of the Mexican War, then, is a story of how anti-Catholicism emerges integral to 19th century American identity as a white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant republic. The American experience with Mexico's Catholic culture occurred at a key moment in American search for religious meaning. They're in this frenetic expansion westward. They're searching for the meaning of this. Is there any meaning in it, or are we all just going west to get rich? Is it all just because I want to live free? What is it? Is there any greater meaning to all of this? But it's also a pivot point in the evolution of the anti-Catholic movement. At a time when Roman Catholicism was under attack in the United States as anti-Republican and as a conspiratorial threat, these Americans then, tens of thousands of them in the Army, their first experience with Catholics occurred in Mexico. That cultural encounter put to the test all those accusations against Catholics. Now, there were some accusations. There were doubts about Catholic patriotism. So, for instance, would the Catholics side with Mexico because Mexico was an officially Catholic country and they were Catholics, or would they side with the United States? So when Catholics would say things like, rah, 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 we're on the side of the United States, the anti-Catholic newspapers would say, I can't believe they won't support their own people. This proves that they're terrible people. But if you try to say something nice about Mexico, it's even worse for you. Now, there was the infamous San Patricio or St. Patrick Brigade, that is the defection of Irish Catholic soldiers from the American Army who went over to the Mexican side, lured by farmland and the ability not to be abused by nativist officers in the Army, among other things they were lured by. That doesn't exactly help the Irish Catholic cause in the United States to prove how patriotic they are during the war. So the American perceptions of what many of the soldiers just called the Catholic race of Mexicans confirmed hearsay about and provided fresh evidence of Catholic debauchery, of economic backwardness, of political tyranny. Any place the Catholic Church touches is going to be decrepit and backward and politically unstable. The war reinforced those preconceptions. That in turn led soldiers to reach conclusions about immigrants and Catholics back home, and they come back home ready to stop the Irish from immigrating, ready to stop Catholicism from growing in the country, and that becomes the big issue of the 1850s until slavery overtakes it around 1857. The soldiers' experience to them seemed to be a warning of the dangers of allowing Roman Catholicism to gain the ascendancy in the United States. So I read through all their diaries and all of their letters, and I quote them quite a bit in the book. I just try to summarize it briefly. But what it proved to me was that they were relying on books that they clearly had read and were even taking to Mexico. Guidebooks that would write about Mexico in almost kind of in a pseudoscientific way, in an anthropological way, but would also have the big section on their religion. And it was usually not very positive. Sometimes positive, not usually. So they relied on that anti-Catholic vocabulary that people like Beecher might use, and these are just soldiers. These are people who were farmers or something else. These weren't people who would cut their teeth on reading long treatises about how bad Catholics are. But it just had soaked in somehow. Those themes intermixed with a racialism to make sense out of the strange country of Mexico. So some drew on the black legend and they faulted Mexico's Spanish heritage. Others said, no, it's the Indian heritage of Mexico. The problem is it's not Spanish enough. Others called them the degenerate sons of the Aztecs, that's a quote, or quote unquote, the mulatto Mexicans. But what was common in all these descriptions was that nearly all referred to Mexicans as Romanists, as priest-ridden, and the church as an iron yoke with a mental thraldom over, quote, the deluded Mexicans. So what's the solution for a country like this? Well, if you conquer and annex it, you've just created 5 more million American Catholics. So that's a problem if you take the most populated parts. You could destroy them and drive them into the sea like some kind of Old Testament fury, and there's a lot of language about Canaanites and Hebrews in their writings too. But many recommended the destruction of the church and the introduction of Protestant Bibles, and just thought nature would take its course after that. That would be the solution to Mexico's political instability. They connected religion then to politics. Regardless of the verbal content and very wide-ranging racial rhetoric about color and race in the 19th century was this thing that was so malleable, they would use terms like Protestant race and Catholic race, so not simply a matter of color. The ultimate cause, the proximate cause of Mexican inferiority always seemed to remain religion, I argue, not biology and not skin color. So they might be inferior biologically, so they choose an inferior religion. Did the religion make them inferior, or are they biologically inferior to these supreme Anglo-Saxons? You can't tell, but somehow religion's always in the mix. I mean, this is one of the things I uncovered in this research that I think is very, very important. So the Mexican War then is what unearthed the widespread influence of anti-Catholicism in American culture, because it revealed territorial expansion, Anglo-Saxonism, republicanism, anti-Catholicism, these things that historians and scholars like to study separately all the time, revealed them to be inseparable parts of one ideology of American exceptionalism. So by 1845, as I said, it had this name, Manifest Destiny, and this discourse transcended section, it transcended religious denomination, it transcended political party. People in favor of the war used it, people opposed to the war used it. The pacifists used it, the abolitionists used it. If you can't convince somebody by saying, should we really add further lands that might become slave territory, maybe you can convince them, as many abolitionists did, by saying, do you really want to add more Catholics to the country? No less an abolitionist than William Lloyd Garrison said this. He said, the war is evil, but at least it might convert Mexicans to a pure gospel. And he was about as radical of an abolitionist as there was. A lot of these diaries and letters of soldiers were published. People read them, other than just the people who were written to, and they all became new fodder for the anti-Catholic movement back home. They become the new Maria Monk, as it were. So in this sense, the war even thematically enhanced anti-Catholic literature. by providing evidence. You're kind of ambivalent. You think Catholics, they might be troublesome, but I've never seen it. I don't know. Oh yeah, well look what happens when they rule the country in its entirety. Here's the examples of the debauchery and depravity. In essence, the wartime experience seemed to say, this is what happens when you let Catholicism shape the culture of a country. So the war then offered concrete evidence to convince the wavering and non-sectarian about the truth of anti-Catholic tales and nativist conspiracy theories. And in the meantime, evangelicals remained mindful of Beecher's warnings about the West until the Civil War. They had a continent to save from barbarism and from Catholicism. And linking evangelical Protestant Christianity more closely than ever before to American Republican government and the meaning of America, they lent their tacit approval to the conquest of territory. An American victory might regenerate Mexico by firmly establishing civil and religious liberty there. More important, a successful American campaign would inevitably increase U.S. territory, and then America could settle those lands, and Americans could carry with them republicanism and Protestantism, and they thought, the superior fortitude to make full use of both. And so I'll close, not with my words, but with those of Samuel F.B. Morse, and the only known statement he made about the Mexican War, writing to his brother in a letter, though he may have written anonymous editorials to some of the nativist New York papers he was editor of. Here's what Morse had to say. He wrote this out. He didn't... The Mexican race is a worn-out race, and God in his providence is taking this mode, he means the war, to regenerate them. Whatever may be the opinion of some in relation to the justness or unjustness of our quarrel, Ulysses S. Grant later called it the most unjust war ever fought by a strong nation against a weak nation. There ought to be but one opinion among all good men, and that should be that the moment should be improved to throw light into that darkened nation. Our Bible and tract societies and missionaries ought to be in the wake of our armies. End quote. This is a religious war for Morse, in other words. I will close with that, and thank you very much. It's very hot in here, so thank you for putting up with the talk. Thanks for coming. It could be. You never want to be, so for those of you who are young and you haven't given public talk, never be photographed with a drink unless it's water. You always see somebody standing like this in a public photograph, you know that they know. So,
That's intriguing.
should I pick, you pick the...
Well, let's do this. If you have a question, we're going to use the mic so we can get it recorded. I like to get the Q&A onto one CD if I can. So if you do have a question, I ask that you keep the question brief and don't present any secondary lecture before the question. Fair enough?
Oh yeah, that's good. The question must be a question.
Yes, yes. So who's first? I saw a couple of hands pop up over here. We'll go to the back. Paul.
So do you see any connection today with anti-immigration rhetoric that's geared definitely towards Latinos with this very religiously motivated anti-Mexican back in the 1800s?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question, Paul. Thank you. It's hard to say. I mean, there certainly is a connection, I think, the way many Americans might think about Muslim immigrants, more than the Mexican immigrants, in terms of threats to religious liberty and the potential for instituting Sharia law in American cities and that kind of thing. So there's that thinking. As far as the Latinos, you know, it's interesting that some of the most vigorous anti-immigrant forces, Pat Buchanan, for instance, right, and a Catholic of Irish ancestry. So I think, you know, our current politics are so complex, I try not even to wade into them as in a storm because I don't really know the answer to your question. I think people's opinions on something like that can be driven by a host of factors, can't they? And not simply religion. So, you know, religion may or may not be in the mix, but people's understanding of race now is also very different than it would have been in the 19th century, where religion would be the most important thing about folks. So it's a very complicated, which is kind of a weenie answer, but really I don't know the answer. That's such a complex question, I don't know.
Do we say our name? Ryan Schinkel from the University of Michigan. My question is, what do you make of the fact that contemporary Catholics today who say that Catholicism and American republicanism are incompatible are agreeing with this long, deep-seated American anti-Catholicism who use that very same argument against Catholics and specifically Mexican Catholics?
Let's get to the microphone. So it's a good question because I didn't, that I guess that was somehow subconsciously that there's kind of a trail of that in the book. There was a couple of reviews of the book and First Things and Ethica Politica and some other places that kind of noted that. And I didn't really note that when I was writing it. I mean, I was writing a history book and about these folks who lived in, but I think it kind of, it informs that a little bit. It's interesting, and that's why, I posed the question tonight, and I don't yet have an answer. So there was a recent article I'd recommend to you by, I think, a gentleman who spoke here not long ago, Patrick Deneen, on liberalism and First Things. It's not too many issues old, and it was excellent on just this topic. I don't yet know the answer myself, but I think the question seems more important than it was even 10 years ago. So whether we can look back to the Enlightenment era founding of the United States and liberal republicanism and predict simply from that we would come to where we are today, I think would also ignore the behavior of Americans in the intervening period and Catholics who seem to do just fine in a country founded during the Enlightenment on liberal republican principles. So I think one of the difficulties has been, as Tocqueville thought, the growth in the size and influence and power of the U.S. government and its eradication of its ability to have a national church. So if secular humanism is an ideology tantamount to being a religion and a worldview, then we have an established church, don't we? But a secular humanism. But it's as much a threat to Protestants as it is to Catholics. I think you see that now, at least with this kind of ecumenism in the trenches that Catholics and evangelicals are engaged in. First, having engaged in that to save the lives of babies in the womb, but now in terms of religious liberty and protecting colleges and businesses from a federal government, a government that picks on nuns. Yeah.
You can do one more.
My question seems to be that the history of this is very tied to geography, and I'm wondering, since America seems to have stopped its expansions from a geographic perspective, do you think that has impacted the historical significance of this anti-Catholicism?
There are areas of the country like New England that went from being heavily Protestant to heavily Catholic, and now they're just kind of, I don't know about you, I don't think of Massachusetts or Connecticut as heavily Catholic places, especially Massachusetts, where some of my ancestors lived and cousins live now. Geographically, the question's interesting. I mentioned Frederick Jackson Turner, the Wisconsin historian, and what he said in this very famous address in Chicago to other historians in 1893 was that the single most significant factor in shaping the American character, and therefore American identity in some way, was the existence of a frontier, but a receding frontier. So you imagine Americans arrive on the East Coast and they just keep going west. And the British can't stop them. They don't want them to go west of Appalachia, and they say, oh, you want to bet? And they fight a revolution over that and taxes, and they go west of Appalachia. Then they're to the Mississippi. That takes a couple hundred years, but it takes 50 years to get all the way to the West Coast after that. It starts moving very rapidly. And what Turner said in 1893, there's no more frontier. Part of the response to that was imperialism during the presidency of William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt, and so you expand outward into the Pacific and you start taking atolls in the Pacific and the Philippines and other places. But another response was the so-called progressives, who were who were sure that there would now be no way to Americanize immigrants if they didn't have the frontier experience to Americanize them, to make them self-sufficient and value democracy and value liberty, things they probably didn't have where they had come from, or they wouldn't have left. So what do you do now? How do you Americanize them now if you don't have a frontier? Well, social engineering was the answer the progressives had. Social control as well was their answer. So where are we today with that? I mean, I think we're still back to my answer to this other gentleman's question, where geography doesn't play the role so much as the ability, the coercive power of the U.S. government, I think. That seems to be the main problematic thing here in terms of the lives of Catholics, but Christians generally, I would say, in this case. So this is the current anti-Catholicism is what Philip Jenkins in a book called The New Anti-Catholicism, which is a great and explanatory title, better than my own for my book, but the new anti-Catholicism, well, this is very different than the old anti-Catholicism. The new anti-Catholics aren't all that concerned in religious truth, are they? Dr. Marshall could correct me if I'm wrong, and he always does. But I don't think I am. So the new anti-Catholics are concerned with their libido and their behavior and their desires. They're not concerned that the Pope may or may not be the Antichrist, because they don't believe in Christ and they don't believe in the Antichrist either. So that's not their concern. But there are people out there who believe in Christ, right? And they're not Catholic, some of them. So in this fight, they're on the side of the Catholics. In that sense. So it's such a more complex world we live in. I think the Church in her wisdom has been gracious in talking about ecumenism for a number of decades now, even prior to the advent of this newer and more dangerous in some ways anti-Catholicism. Okay. Thank you. I'll come back.